Let me start by thanking DBLAC for this opportunity. I mentioned the other day that DBLAC is out here in these internet streets. They are the best hype team I've ever seen. I'm grateful for this effort. I think it's necessary. I hope that eventually there are more conversations about our work because, we need to have these critical conversations. Rhetorical healing, the re-education of contemporary Black womanhood, is the evolution of my work to answer a couple of questions since I've come into the doctoral section of my experience in Rhet Comp. I went through an MA program where I was introduced to language politics. I read a lot of our foremothers and forefathers, Dr. G, Dr. Gilliard, etc. And reading them early on helped me see how transformative education and language education in particular is for African Americans. But when I got to my doctoral program, I was really trying to figure out this question of what does African American rhetorics look like when it's not overt performed political oratory, right? So, we can read Ida B. Wells' essays, we can read Frederick Douglass, but when we're talking internally, what does it look like? And so I wanted to take up, what does African American rhetoric look like in vernacular spaces? Spaces where I really saw myself as doing actualizing work, the church, some of the plays that I was watching, etc. Even some of the books that my girlfriends were reading. And so I had the opportunity to take an independent study with Adam Banks. He encouraged me to look at Tyler Perry as a critical space, his plays, to look at Tyler Perry's plays as a space where I could understand African American rhetoric, these themes of community, these themes of wellness and therapy that I was seeing in Medea's Family Reunion, etc. While I was doing that independent study, though, I was also getting a necessary immersion in Black feminism with Gwendolyn Pugh. And if you take a class with Gwendolyn Pugh, and I'll always say this, I credit her because she completely changed the way I see. So here I am trying to look at Tyler Perry plays, right? And understand what is rhetorically happening. How is there messages of collectivity, wellness? At the same time, asking these questions like, but why are women always the subjects? Why are they always the people being almost talked to? And so the combination of asking those questions led me to complete a dissertation where I looked at T.D. Jakes and Iyanla Vanzant to really just name discourses on return, discourses on transformation, discourses on revision as kind of African American rhetorics of healing. And then to at least start the work of figuring out a systematic way that we could critique them from a Black feminist informed perspective. That was my dissertation. Finishing this, by the time I finished it, Iyanla is back. She is made up with Oprah. She has her shows. Tyler Perry has received permission to adapt the Black feminist classic for colored girls. And so I started to think about what does it mean that we are now kind of giving him the license to take on this really pivotal Black feminist text? T.D. Jakes is about to get a talk show. Oprah is going into Oprah 2.0. And so then I started to look at what does it mean that Oprah is endorsing these projects? And at that point, I'm starting to see those discourses on return, transformation, revision were actually operating as genres. And if I look at them as genres and take them a step further, I can look at them as campaigns, using what Thomas Miller describes as a literacy campaign, or kind of a reactionary re-education project that happens in response to a paradigm shift. The paradigm shift that I saw was the Black women's literary renaissance. And so if you think about the color purple for colored girls, etc., Black women starting to turn a conversation about wellness inward and talk to each other, then even the most concerned people, the most concerned constituencies within African American communities, ministers, playwrights, teachers, they're going to have to follow suit. They're going to have to adapt the genre strategies to talk to Black women audiences. And so the project then became about wellness campaigns. And I started to read across, like, okay, so then what are the strategies when we go across Van Zant's early work and then connect it to her current work, across more Tyler Perry films, across T.D. Jakes' stuff, and thinking and positioning Oprah as something as a literacy sponsor. And so then, by the time I finished that manuscript, I had come to the language of The Learning Cure, which was supposed to be the title of this book. I wanted to call it The Learning Cure, Rhetorical Healing and Black Womanhood. But you know, you do what you need to do to get your book out. The Learning Cure didn't really land the way that I thought it would land, but I actually hold on to that idea because one of the conclusions that I found through doing this research is these genre strategies show us a lot about how Black women are positioned as student consumers. And a lot of people can see themselves as taking social action to repair communities by teaching Black women. And so if you think of even Oprah, who once said, you know, you want to help heal a community, teach a Black girl. And I don't disagree with that. But when people are able to build full careers off of that, when that's kind of the launching point for them going public, then I think, particularly in rhetoric and composition, we would benefit from looking at this. You know, we would benefit from stepping back and saying, okay, if we understand African American rhetorics as, you know, technologies towards freedom struggle, then I would say, oh, it's, you know, it's bigger than that. African American rhetorics and literacies function sometimes as action taking, not that are the most successful when we think about healing, actually work to say to Black women, come home, you know, resume, take your place. And I don't necessarily disagree with that argument, but I think it becomes complicated when we get into some kind of gender politics. And so to bring this to a close, I think I wanted rhetorical healing to function as a feminist critique of a social history of African American rhetoric. I wanted to give us a slice of a conversation, to zoom in on a couple of wellness campaigns that, you know, nobody is going to teach. And if they do, kudos to them. But the likelihood that Woman Thou Art Loose is going to end up on an Afro rhetoric syllabus is not high. But has that book had some kind of rhetorical impact? Absolutely. And so when we start to figure out ways to engage and make spaces for those conversations in our study of African American rhetoric, we also need that feminist critique as well. And so I hope that I've taken a step in the direction of doing that work with this book. You know, one of the things I wanted to make sure that I did not do, and I understand that this is the frustration some readers have of rhetorical healing, I was not able to definitively say, this is how Black women have taken up this work, because that would have required me to do some additional research. And while I think that that's important, I acknowledge that that's not what I did. I wanted to understand, why are these particular discussions why do they resonate? And can we look at them critically to understand, you know, what are African Americans doing when they take to teaching through sermons, through narratives, through the conduct book? You know, how can we understand that? And it's interesting, The Learning Cure was because I understand Black feminism as a literacy. You know, like, I understand myself as a Black feminist because in doing self-actualizing work, I learn of a different way to decipher public transcripts. So if that's the moment that's happening in the 70s and the 80s, And then you've got this wave of self-help books that are using literacy metaphors, vision, like discernment, all of this stuff. Then yes, they are marketing a learning cure. They are reselling a literacy. And so that was kind of the critical, I wanted to be able to lay that out as a moment. And yeah, I hope that there are implications for the study of literacy, but I think I really came at this as naming and historicizing.
We read your book in Gwen's class this semester, and one of the questions that people kind of were wondering about was, how was it for you when you were engaging with different, because you focus on T.D. Jakes, Tyler Perry, and Ayanya, and Oprah. So you probably have networks and community members who are also engaged or look at these figures positively or negatively, I don't know. So how is it for you approaching the critical aspect of that and the way you talked about each figure, knowing that you also have people that you're probably in communities with that engage with these figures as well?
Thank you for that question. The reason why I initially talk about rhetorical competence and rhetorical consequence as ways that I evaluate these discourses is because as I try to make clear at the end of the book, my best friends have full bookshelves of Iyanla Vanzant's work. My mom is sending me to buy the T.D. Jakes, or not the T.D. Jakes, the Tyler Perry film. I have had one-on-one encounters where I've met T.D. Jakes. And so, I understand that there is an expectation for a type of criticism, but my own positionality as a person who I feel like I was one of the target audiences of these types of discourses. And then trying to do work that acknowledges that people still find value in it. Like, I don't know that I wanted to ever write a book where it feels like I trash them, but I also wanted to do work where I try to find a balance. And so, I imagine I know there are plenty who feel like I'm too complimentary. But then I also think about, if my work as a scholar, particularly talking about a subject like healing, means that I may not only be talking to other academics about this research. I've been invited to speak to churches about this. And so I don't know that it's the best rhetorical stance to really come in with the most harsh, scathing critique when on Sunday, somebody's going to say, Tamika, get up, tell us about your book. And if I want this work of facilitating a kind of discernment about how African-American rhetoric circulate, I have to think about multiple audiences, not just like academics. And so this was not an easy book to write, Dayla. Like, I don't, because I am trying to do an honest feminist critique, but to also think about, what about Black women who do not yet consider themselves feminist? How can I still talk to them in a way? How can I still say, this person who actually wrote this book and you read it and you found some help from, how can I tell them, oh, now look at it from this standpoint, if I come at it from the most harsh, critical angle? And so again, it was not easy to write because I saw myself as the audience. And I think that some of these texts do some good work. How do we make space then how do we make everyday use out of the stuff that, is good, but could certainly be better? How can iron sharpen iron if my tone is so geared towards the most harsh critical stance?
Yeah, I commend you for tackling that, because I definitely know that was probably difficult. But it actually helped me, and also thank you for your answer, especially because I engage with T.D. Jakes the most, I think, out of all the people that you engaged with. It did allow me to look at him in a different way with a critical eye and a perspective I hadn't. And I think that was useful. I did find that useful. So thank you.
I remember in my defense, and I don't think he'll be mad that I mentioned this, Adam Banks was like, you're pretty complimentary to Iyanla, T.D. Jakes, Tyler Perry, but you come across so harsh with Steve Harvey. And he's right. And I think that was because, at least with Van Zandt, Tyler Perry, T.D. Jakes, I could see a catalog. For some reason, when Harvey like released Act Like a Lady, Think Like a Man, it rubbed me in a different way. Because I thought like, wow, is that a practical message? Can you actually do that? And so I feel like by that point, my patience wasn't what it needed to be. And so, that too comes across in tone.
You speak, I think, in your introduction about pain and the usefulness of, or the use of pain, and especially Black women's pain in regards to like advocacy and action and just the importance of our existence. How, I guess this is like a typical, grad student question, how did you balance that with your writing, with your engagement in these materials, and balancing your pain and exhaustion in looking at these artifacts and objects and kind of analyzing them?
I will say that the chapter where I felt like I was really digging into Black women's pain is the one that was actually the most pleasurable for me to write, which is, Are You Really Sure You Want to Be Well? And that was one of the chapters that I came to much later, because it occurred to me, conversations among Black women about healing, they're not new. Like we go way back. Black women have been talking about healing and wellness for a long time and doing that work. And if you read Black women's literary traditions far back, you'll see that wellness has always kind of blurred a line with learning and advocacy, etc. I didn't feel pain engaging these artifacts. I felt almost like an overt therapeutic kind of thrust from them, if that makes sense. And so, I'm sure that there's a way that you could have looked at these conversations and discourses and picked up a far more kind of critical, sociological, psychological read, but they felt like heavy. They felt therapeutic, ministerial, etc. And it could be my own positionality, and that's why I heard them that way. But I didn't hear like pain. I didn't feel pain in those archives. I felt the pain when I was reading Beloved, when I was reading The Salt Eaters, when I was teaching for colored girls. That's that conversation of pain. Cheryl Clark's work, Audre Lorde's stuff. I felt when I read Woman, Thou Art Loose, when I read The Value in the Valley, I didn't feel pain. I felt redress. I felt response, etc. So it was a different read. But, I think that is also why I want us to really be careful in how we do talk about wellness, because if pain can become something that is depoliticized, and that's why I love that opening moment with Van Zandt, pay attention inward now, and how Oprah's like, because if you watch the actual video clip of it, and I was like, okay, I don't disagree, but I was like, an acronym? Like this pain could be so much. I don't want this thing to be, I just have a deep respect for that. And I think, I want it to have the severity, the important seriousness that it deserves.
Thanks for writing this book. First of all, I'm coming to this text from a literature background, And so this was more of a teaching tool for me, a learning tool for me, because I am positioned in all of these communities, TDJ, No More Sheets, and I'm very familiar with everything that happens. And so I did not get a sense of suspicion when I read your work. I felt that you were positioned in them and writing outwardly, which made me kind of trust you a little bit more than I generally do other scholars. And so I heard you talk about how difficult this book was to write. And I'm wondering, how did you reconcile those resistances that you may have felt while you were writing it and the responsibility to present this information in a balanced way?
Yeah. You know, I think that's where exhaustion comes in, because I think that I was getting to the point where I was just sitting with this text so much, and I was getting nervous that the analysis was late. And I don't know if that has ever happened to you as a scholar, where it's like, I start this project and I was like, this hot, like I'm in front of the game. And then by the time you get the manuscript done, it's like, yeah, we ain't talking about that. And so I felt like a clock. And then I also felt like this tug of trying to do it in a way that honors like real feminist criticism, because again, I'm not the only person that's talked about this. You got the Crunk Feminist Collective, Tamara Lomax, you know, people have come in and really done full-on analogies of Tyler Perry, etc. I think I wanted to be in conversation with them, but I also needed to do my own work to figure out like what kind of tone of voice I wanted to have as a scholar. And it took me a long time, to the point where I was just fatigued. And it became surrender, right? Like, okay, it is done. I don't think I can revise anymore. And let me try to trust my readers. And so, you know, navigating the tension wasn't easy. It wore me out. And I just let it go. And so I hope that's an answer to what I heard you asking me. Okay. Okay. Can I ask you something, Brianna? So I was looking at the conversation that you had, and you tagged in Van Zandt. And I was like, oh, and I was watching it and I was thinking, oh, I don't know. Not like I'd throw rocks and hide my hand, but at the same time, I was like, oh, I don't think I've ever thought about, you know, what it would be like to be in actual conversation with the writers of these texts. You said that you're positioned as one of the people who might be a target audience for works like this. What do you see in terms of changing how you saw the text?
How I saw your text, or
seeing these conversations, these campaigns now?
Yeah, actually, because I came to their campaigns in the midst of my own healing processes. And so TD Jakes was more in my formative years, where I was trying to learn how to have a relationship with God. And so I did attend Woman Hour at least a few years. And I did read the books. I have some books back here by TD Jakes. And so, you know, I was really trying to learn from him. When I came to Juanita Bynum, who I'm a major fan of, it was more of a deliverance type of thing, where I was like, yeah, I really need to hear it. And I really respected her authority. I heard the authority in her voice. And so I was like, this is what I need. I don't need anyone to be nice and loving. I need someone to give me the hard truth. And then Van Zandt was like, oh, this is consoling. Like, this is very nice. She's very mothering and nurturing. And so it really just made me pay attention to them more and start thinking outside of my own personal development and healing. And also, you gave me language. I have a book club. And so I was like, oh, I didn't know that I was participating in a literacy campaign or a wellness campaign. Like, I didn't know these things, but it was just something that I felt that I was most comfortable with, and people can read if they want to read. And so I really it caused me to pay more attention. I was just thinking, oh, this is just the church. You know, this is what they do. And I didn't have a critical lens for what they were doing, because I'm in literature and not rhetoric and conversation.
And you know, I use the term rhetorical re-education because to me, the way that these wellness campaigns have rolled out, it seems like they're functioning in a way to get people to come back and keep enacting certain roles. If Black women are upset and if they start to, you know, kind of move away from a traditional heteronormative family and all of the kind of complications that go with that, and then these books are saying like, no, come back, resume, etc. I mean, even Iyanla Vanzant, one of the earliest works talking about a conscious tongue. And I was like, so now wellness, you're actually going to tell people how to speak? To me, that felt, the language that I used was rhetorical education. And I'm borrowing Jessica Enoch's definition where she was talking about like training for civic participation, training for civic roles. And so I can also see how people would see it as a literacy education. The curriculum, I was focusing, to me, that process of becoming well is the literacy competencies. That position of standing in wellness is rhetorical education, right? Like we know that you're well because now we can read your behaviors in a certain way. We can trust that you're going to enact these social roles that we need the Black woman to keep enacting, and particularly the Christian Black woman, because I can acknowledge, you know, I thought it was obvious, but I can also see how people could read this book and say, well, you left out, you know, non-heterosexual women, you know, people who do not subscribe to Christianity and read these books as well. How is their kind of subjectivity as Black women being shaped by these discourses? And so that's a kind of distinction I wanted to get out there.
Yeah, that was probably the toughest part of your book for me to read. I was telling Kirsten, like, there were moments where I'm like, yes, and there were moments where I'm like, oh no, I probably shouldn't agree. Do I agree? I don't know. And it caused me to really evaluate what I believe. When you had a line that says, these things are to keep the Black woman in line. And I was like, no, yeah, maybe, I don't know. Like, is it? Because I never thought of it that way. I thought of it as like, this will probably help you, so you should probably take this. And a lot of the things that a lot of the pastors say and the people that you brought up in this book, I don't necessarily agree with, but that's just because of my educational training.
Yeah. And let's talk about like the way that and I don't know that I necessarily talk or make this explicit enough, but particularly when I would watch Tyler Perry films, there seemed to be a real focus on getting those middle class aspirational Black women together. Like when I think of Daddy's Little Girls, I mean, it's pretty much like, girl, like, be glad you got this man and this wife beater. I know you have this high corporate job. I know you live in this, you know, penthouse, but you really need to wake up and see this good blue collar man in front of you. And so then, right, like, how do you reconcile faith plus our own kind of critical education that we acquire when we keep going to school? And so then it becomes a conflict of the academy versus the church. And then, you know, it's sort of like, how do you reconcile that? And how do you make peace with, I need these discourses from the church that shape me because they fortify me in a particular way, but I can't turn off this critical lens that I've acquired now that I've been in the academy. What do you do with that? And so that's why I was trying to address those questions from competence and consequence. Like, yeah, they do this well, but if this blows up and becomes an industry, then what? So yeah.
Thank you, Dr. Carey, for joining us, and thank you to everyone else who joined us today. I was wondering if you could talk more about the relationship between like therapy, psychotherapy, mm-hmm. and the concept of rhetorical healing, because as you know, we all know there's a certain stigma attached to therapy amongst Black people, and you see it like in popular culture. I remember a particular moment in the HBO series Insecure where Issa tells Molly like she needs therapy, and she's like, I ain't crazy,
Yes.
like no. And that's like, this is the idea that we have about therapy. So I was wondering if you could talk about the relationship between rhetorical healing and like traditional psychotherapy.
Well, I think that, you know, traditional psychotherapy, I'm glad that there's the embrace of it, particularly among Black women, that we're starting to see now. And I credit a lot of contemporary Black feminists for going back and reclaiming, you know, Toni Cade Bambara, June Jordan, Audre Lorde, in those discourses of self-care, and taking self-care into, that might mean that you actually need to make an appointment with someone, and we can't immediately pray it away. Right. So I'm happy to see self-care taking on the kind of role that it's having among contemporary Black women. But where rhetorical healing is concerned, I wanted us to be able to name the templates. And I saw rhetorical healing as a way to say, like, oh, I can identify, you're trying to therapize me, or you know, you're trying to do some kind of psychotherapy, and you're using these particular genre strategies. And so I that was my hope. You know, that was what I meant by giving us a critical terminology for it. I've had people tell me like, oh, but you know, like, I want to adopt the work of rhetorical healing. I want to become or do work towards wellness. How do I do that? And I was like, wow, I guess I didn't write the book assuming that people would want to take up the cause of healing Black women. I just got a question like that recently, and use rhetorical healing as something to aspire to. And I thought, wow, I didn't see that coming because I was trying to name a trend, and now they're trying to take that as a goal. And I was thinking, I don't know that I necessarily want rhetorical healing to be a goal. I want it to be something that informs actual advocacy work, actual allyship that could help, you know, kind of alleviate some of the things that wound Black women. And so I hope I've addressed it. You know, as you were talking about Insecure, that's a much more recent example. There was an episode of The Game where Tasha Mack goes to therapy. And I was trying to get that into that conclusion because I was like, oh my God, you know, like, and the whole way that she was like, Black women don't go to therapy. Like, we don't do that. And, you know, it just, I don't think I couldn't get it in there in a way that was smooth. But I want to hope that our social consciousness is shifting in a way where self-care really catches on and it becomes something that is a commitment, you know, a mandate, a requirement. Yeah. I hope I've answered that for you.
When we were in class discussing the book, a few people were curious what would a healing campaign look like? Mm-hmm. Just because you discussed maybe some positives or things that could be adjusted in the ones that Ayanya and T.D. Jakes, Tyler Perry. So there are actually people interested.
I know. And you know, every time that I talk about this work beyond academia, that is the expectation, because beyond academia, people are like, oh yeah, that critique is cute. Mm-hmm. Help me help people. and so part of what I am trying to do with some work that I'm going to be launching here at UVA, ideally, is to look at, you know, how can I help train writing consultants, certainly not coaches, that can help people employ narrative therapy if that's, you know, a process that they want. If oral histories, if writing memoirs could be something that could at least facilitate that, using literacy towards that end. But like I said, you know, I was trying to write a critical history, but the thing of it is, healing is such a ongoing, necessary thing that people are going to have that like praxis expectation, for sure. Yeah. You know, the question, and I'll jump in here. One question that was shared with me was, you know, and I'm paraphrasing the question, as a white person, how do I contribute to healing for Black women or Black women's wellness? What does that look like? And in answering that question, I realized, you know, yes, it does involve some critical listening skills. That's why at the end of the book, I try to talk about that experience teaching Dr. E's PhD to PhD, because, you know, that was a book. I built a whole class so I could teach her memoir. And so to teach that and to be on like the second session and the students just shut down, I was so disappointed. But I realized, you know, sometimes our work as teachers of rhetoric and writing is to figure out how to set a climate so that we can talk about the hard stuff. And maybe it was naive of me to walk in with PhD. I never regret teaching that text, but I thought I had set the table in a way where we could stay in the conversation. I don't think that I had anticipated the affect my students would feel reading some of the content. And I look back on it and I was thinking, I remember driving home after that class thinking, like, what can I do to keep them in the conversation? Meanwhile, there were some well-intentioned white students in the class who were like, what can we do? And so in addition to fostering, we got to build upon that rhetorical listening framework that Krista Ratcliffe uses. We also need to talk about moving from allyship, I think, to accomplice. Because to me, an accomplice is a person who's ready to lose something. Whereas an ally can sometimes say, yeah, I feel you, that's terrible. But an accomplice is like, I'll go to jail with you if I have to. And so how can we foster that kind of sense of, investment in the wellness of somebody else? Because, these are questions that I think, tie back into the kind of civic participation, social justice mandate that so many of us who study African American rhetorics have. Long answer to your question, but thank you, Jayla. I love memoir, and I think that that's one of my favorite classes to teach. And so I've been teaching memoir and Black women's memoir for a while, and I want to come back to those texts and that process of writing memoir to figure out how can rhetoricians contribute to the wellness of particular groups. And so in addition to trying to figure out how I can help cultivate writing consultants that can help people document their own stories, I actually also want to go back in and just study Black women's memoirs to figure out what are the literacy practices that are connected to their conception of becoming well. So that's one project. There's another project that builds off of the work that I started to do with Melissa Harris Perry with I was calling it initially Rhetorical Missteps, but the article is called The Tightrope of Perfection, because I also want to think, and I'll just say this, my understanding of rhetorical scholarship and research is that it needs to be a life-preserving endeavor, right? Like, I want the study of rhetoric to protect someone's life, to empower, to improve someone's life. And for me, that has involved me looking at some of the ugliest instances of the backlash outspoken Black women are receiving. So when we think about Melissa Harris Perry and what happened and some of the death threats she had, Jamel Hill, Zerlina Maxwell, people like that, what day are we living in where if you make the wrong statement, there's death threats? And I'm not saying this happens just to Black women, but as an African American rhetoric and literacy and a Black feminist researcher, I think we have a particular way of looking at these moments where we can understand error, apology, regret, threat, etc. So I'm trying to get my mind into a fuller extension of that project. And then most recently, I came across discussions of impatience. And so what I'm calling rhetorics of impatience, and trying to tease out, not like I really listen to R. Kelly these days, but when a woman is fed up and starts to speak out, like, what is it that mobilizes us to say, okay, I got time today, or, ain't nobody got time for that. When do we hit that point of like, oh no, I'm tired of this. My fatigue has set in and I have no more energy to give this, and I will act. I think that move is something that interrogated can also push our understanding of like Black feminisms and rhetorics. So enough. Couple of things come to mind. I've been very fortunate to still be in very close relationship with the networks I built in graduate school. I see my mentor several times a year. I'm grateful for that. I hope that DBLAC can function in a way to prevent isolation, because isolation for scholars of color in graduate school and in the new professoriate, it's the stuff that will convince you you're not supposed to be here. and that's what I hope to guard you against, to hope that you will guard yourself against that. I would suggest, and I know this is something that may not be in the character of everyone, but I've been at different retreats and people would say to me like, oh, I saw you at that conference, but you were at a table with people and I didn't really feel like I could walk up and say hello to you. Walk up, right? Like you don't know, there's so many scholars of color in the field who want to see more scholars of color in the field. And even if, it's your personality and temperament to not want to interrupt someone, I would say take the risk, because, there are people who are invested, like those of us who are fortunate to still be standing. And I'm gonna show you my bookcase. Like you can see, I got the pictures with like Gwen, Dr. E. I got one of my favorites with like Dr. Royster, Dr. G. These pictures have traveled with me from institution to institution because I feel like I've been very fortunate to have experiences where when I needed advice, people were there and they weren't hostile to me. But while I've realized that I'm fortunate for that, I would encourage people to ask for that. Ask for what you need. Don't allow yourself to be isolated. Do what you can to understand your project and your value, because sometimes institutions operate in a way where they work to disempower you. They work to make you question, your identity as a scholar, the value or the contributions of your work, how you got this appointment, etc. And so if you can stay in communication with a cohort of people, that's a real thing. I remember telling someone recently that I was seeing the development of all these scholarly collectives maybe about 4 years ago. I mentioned the Crunk Feminist Collective, the Pleasure Ninjas. People were they were moving into this group formation thing. And I remember thinking like, yeah, that African proverb, there is something to it. You want to get somewhere fast, go by yourself. You want to get someplace well, go in a group. And wellness might mean a group. I talk about warding yourself from isolation, and I know that from experiences because I can go into my shell sometimes. And so I'm speaking from what I know. Develop those relationships where someone can say like, I haven't seen you in so long. How are you? Yeah, be visible to each other.